Through a process called spawning, particles can be made to do different things when they come into contact with a deflector space warp. By different, I mean being able to either die off or birth other particles when contact with that space warp is made. The file I'll be using for my example is named spawning particles. Now the spawning effect comes through a series of settings not on the deflector, but instead on the particle system, which in our case here is the super spray that's been positioned in the lower right-hand side of our screen. To get to the spawn settings, we'll right-click in any empty area of our command panel, and from the menu choose Particle Spawn. Now as you can see under the spawning effects, we've got quite a few different options. Choosing Die After Collision would do just that, having any particle that collided with a bound space warp disappear, or what Max refers to as die off. So that would work in a situation where maybe you wanted your particles to be absorbed by the bound deflector. Choosing instead Spawn on Collision would have each particle that made contact with the deflector basically duplicate, creating new particles from the original particles. Maybe a glass full of water being poured on the floor would be a good example of using Spawn on Collision. When the liquid collided with the harder surface of the floor, its particles, the water, would break into many more smaller drops or puddles. The Spawns setting controls the number of spawns after or beyond the original particles have been generated. So if you wanted, you could have continual multiple birthing events being driven off a single series of original particles. Now with all these spawn settings, you need to be very conscientious of what these additional particles are going to do to your computer once they hit the screen. Single particle emissions can be taxing on their own. You start adding more and more particles to a scene and you really do start playing with fire. Now that doesn't mean don't use the spawning effects, just be real careful and real aware of how debilitating they can be on even the fastest computer. For our example, we'll leave the spawns value set to 1. Now the effects setting gives you the opportunity to determine just what percentage of original particles actually spawn. So if you set the value to 50 and you had, for an example, 1,000 particles in your scene, only 500 of those particles would create others. Let's go ahead and change that value to 50. Now the big control is multiplier. This determines the number of additional particles that'll be created off each of the original set to spawn particles. Let's take that value to 3. This one's again one of the controls that'll flat out flatten your computer during both screen redraws and especially at render time. So you always want to take that number only as high as it needs to be. Now I only have a certain percentage of my particles being displayed, but you can get the idea of just how the multiplier does business. Variation simply varies the number of particles being spawned from one spawning particle to the next. And you've got chaos controls for both direction and speed. Now those, as the names imply, merely add a little randomness to what they control. I've got both my direction and speed chaos set to 30. Let's take those down to 0 and see the difference it makes in our scene. Now the effect isn't quite so chaotic. For comparison, let's take both the direction chaos and speed chaos back to 30. Now the other two spawning options that we haven't talked about yet are Spawn on Death and Spawn Trails. With Spawn Trails, the spawning of new particles takes place at each frame of that particle's life, thereby creating a trailing type particle flow. Now you can just imagine how crushing that would be to your hardware. New particles being created at each frame that original particle is in play. Now of the options, I think you'll be using the Spawn on Collision setting most often. Do experiment though, as the options are capable of creating many different style of effects. So that'll set you up with some of your options when choosing to create a spawning effect.